Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Sprintax overview of non-resident US tax obligations for those of you on the J1 Bridge USA program. Equally, this will also be useful and beneficial to perhaps your sponsor or sending agent or even host employer, as today I'm going to be walking you through the ins and outs of US tax obligations as they apply to J1 visa holders on the Bridge USA program. So there is lots to cover throughout today's session. I guess just before I kick off, just a general disclaimer. I always like to think of tax as a little bit like your own DNA, in that it might seem like Ryan and you are very much the same on paper, but for one small detail, you could be treated completely differently for tax purposes. So do keep that in mind, that I'm going to try and just give some helpful information around non-resident US taxes today. So what will I be covering in the session today? Well, I'll be looking at a general overview of tax for non-residents on J1 visas. So those of you who are on the Bridge USA program, I'll be talking about everything from your employment income all the way through to your US tax filing obligations at the end of the tax year. We will also outline how you can use Sprintax towards the end to assist you with tax compliance, whether that's getting set up correctly with your employer, and also filing your taxes at the end of the tax season or at the end of the tax year. So I suppose in terms of where to start, I usually always will start with the concept of residency for tax purposes, because this is essentially what sets us apart from, maybe your fellow US citizen, work colleagues, or roommates. I guess in the eyes of the IRS, generally J1 interns, trainees, summer work and travel participants, camp counselors, au pairs, teachers, and researchers, they are automatically considered as a non-resident for tax purposes by the IRS, which is the US federal tax authorities, for 2 tax years in the US. Very simply put, as a non-resident for tax purposes, different tax rules are going to apply to you than your fellow US citizen work colleagues or roommates, and you'll need to file different tax forms than a resident for tax purposes. So for those two years, you're generally deemed a non-resident for tax. If you are now in maybe your 3rd year, your days then start counting towards what's called a substantial presence test, which essentially will count all of your non-exempt days towards this test. And if you've been present for more than 183 days in that 3rd year, you'll then be deemed long enough in the US to be considered a resident for tax purposes. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about this on how Sprintax software can make this a little bit easier for you to understand your tax residency. I'm sure many of you are about to start your employment in the coming months ahead, or maybe you've already just about started your job in the US on your J program. I want to talk a little bit about some of the important things around your employment income, and I suppose the tax implications on that. So I guess it's really important to know that the IRS will require federal tax withholding on US income that you earned during the year. And essentially, non-residents for tax purposes are usually taxed at the graduated tax rates of withholding, unless you have tax treaty exempt income. So that basically means you'll pay federal tax withholding from 10% upwards, depending on the level of your income during the year. So for example, if you're earning under $11,600 in 2024, 10% federal tax withholding should, in theory, be withheld from your employer on that income. And then the rate of withholding increases as you get above that 11,600, and it goes from 12% all the way through to as high as 37%. It's also really important to know that a big difference between a non-resident for tax purposes and a US resident for tax purposes is that non-residents for tax cannot use the standard deduction that US citizens or residents can claim. The only exception there is that an Indian student, trainee, or business apprentice can use that standard deduction. Everyone else, unfortunately, cannot. If you're also tuning in today and you are a J1 au pair, it's very likely that au pairs are not going to be taxed on the payments that you receive from your host family. So if that's the case, I would recommend setting aside 10 or 12% of the income that you're earning from your host family, because you'll likely need to pay that back to the IRS when you file your tax return at the end of the year. So for those of you that are receiving employment income from your employer, you'll likely see on your pay stub every week that there might be a section called Social Security or Medicare taxes. That's what I'm talking about with regards to FICA tax. And this is a tax that's supposed to help you later on in life with the cost of healthcare in the USA. Now, in the eyes of the IRS, as long as you are a non-resident for tax purposes on your J1 visa, you are exempt from paying into FICA taxes. So if you're noticing that Social Security or Medicare taxes are being withheld by your employer and you are a non-resident for tax, it's really, I would recommend chatting with your employer to outline that J1 visa holders that are non-residents for tax are exempt from paying FICA taxes. Your employer can refund those FICA taxes back. And for any employers tuning in, you could amend your quarterly or annual 941s when you amend or refund those FICA taxes back. If the employer cannot refund those FICA taxes back, you can prepare a FICA tax claim, which is called Form 843 and 8316. And it is something that Sprintax returns can help to prepare for you when you're filing your taxes. Now, I also now want to talk about your tax filing obligations for J1 Bridge USA visa holders. So if we fast forward now to tax filing season 2024, which will be from January to April 15th, 2025, this is where you'll need to file a end of year income tax return with the IRS, which is the US federal tax authorities. And I suppose some important dates here for you to be aware of is that basically when you're filing your federal tax return, the IRS is looking at everything that's happened between January 1st through to December 31st, 2024. So all of the US source income that you earned during that period of time and your time on US soil is what we're concerned about for 2024 tax filing season. And the deadline to file your federal tax return to the IRS for 2024 season is Tuesday, April 15th, 2025. So I always recommend setting a reminder maybe in your phone for maybe sometime in February or March to remind yourself of your federal tax deadlines here. If you're wondering, okay, I've earned US income during 2023, but who needs to actually file a federal tax return with the IRS for 2024 tax season? Well, very simply put, even if you were present as a J1 visa holder that is a non-resident for tax purposes, you would need to file Form 8843 at a minimum. I'll talk about that form in the very next slide. In addition to the 8843, if you earned any US taxable income during 2024, you will need to file a federal tax return by law. And that is the 1040 NR form that you need to file, which is the non-resident tax return. So essentially, every non-resident has some sort of IRS filing obligation if you're present in 2024. So Form 8843, basically think of this as a declaration of non-resident status to the IRS. As I mentioned earlier, the J1 visa types under the Bridge USA program are generally considered a non-resident for tax for 2 tax years in the US. That can also be, labeled as being an exempt individual. That means you're exempt from counting your days of presence in the US towards the substantial presence test. So this form basically confirms to say, hey, my name is Ryan, I'm a J1 work and travel participant, or an au pair, or a camp counselor. Please don't count my days of presence in the US towards this substantial presence test, as I'm still a non-resident for tax. So it is the minimum obligation for all of you J1 visa holders, and Sprintax returns can help prepare this. I'll talk about that very shortly. Now, I also want to talk about some income that doesn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. If you're getting money transferred from your parents or relatives overseas, it's not going to trigger tax obligations. If you had income you earned in your home country, like a job or rental income or investment income, as long as you're a non-resident for tax purposes, the IRS will not look at your worldwide income. It'll only look at your US source income when you are a non-resident for tax purposes. Interest on a regular savings account generally won't even buy you a cup of coffee in the US, but that also likely won't trigger a filing requirement. If it had tax implications, your bank would usually issue you with a 1099 income document. Speaking of income documents, so if you were working during the year or you received employment income or any other form of income that's taxable in the US, it's likely that that income is going to be reported on an income document. Now, for J1 visa holders, it's most likely that you're going to get your employment income reported on a W-2 form. And what a W-2 form does is it outlines the total income that you've received during the tax year and the taxes that were withheld on that income. You'll be able to outline the information from this income document on the Sprintax return software to help prepare your federal tax return. Now, less likely income documents, but potentially you could receive them. A 1042-S form. We usually would see this if you were getting things like prizes or awards, income that was exempt due to a tax treaty. And we also see this quite commonly for any of you that are getting taxable scholarships from maybe a university. But again, or maybe potentially stipends from your host family as well could trigger a 1042-S form. Then finally, other rarer forms of income, maybe rental income in the US, investment income, or work as an independent contractor, you could get that reported on a 1099 series. Most important thing to do is to follow up with your payer in the US at the end of the year to make sure that you have the income document that you need to file your federal tax return. If you're an au pair, you might not be getting taxed or you might not be on payroll by your host family. If that's the case, just keep a track record of all the payments you've been receiving by your host family during the year, because you will be able to outline that income from your host family on Sprintax. Very quick note then as well, if you are here with a spouse or dependents in the US and you are both non-residents for tax, you will both be treated as two separate individuals in the USA in the eyes of the IRS. You'll both need to file your own Form 8843 if you are present in the United States as a non-resident for tax. And if you earned any US source income, you'll both need to file your own separate tax returns. The only way you could file jointly on a US tax return is if you were married to a US citizen or a resident for tax purposes. It's also important to note that there are state tax rules and state tax filing obligations potentially in over 43 states across the USA. There are some states that don't have state income tax. They all have their own residency rules and filing thresholds. The good news there is that the Sprintax return software will help to figure out state filing obligations as well. So don't worry about trying to figure out this on your own. Help is on hand. That leads nicely into the implications of misfiling. If you maybe missed a year in prior years, or maybe you filed as a resident by mistake, don't panic, but do set the record straight. If you've forgotten to file for previous years, you can backfile at any stage, and you can also get a tax refund back if it's within the last 3 years. Alternatively, if you misfiled, maybe you filed using TurboTax by mistake in prior years, you can amend your US tax return. That is called the 1040X form. And the good news here is that Sprintax can help you to both backfile and also prepare an amended tax return if you need help there. I suppose importantly, if you're wondering what are the implications of not filing? Well, what I'd say here is that if you look at the laws set within your US visa, It outlines that you need to oblige by all US laws, including your tax filing obligations, even if that's just Form 8843. So it is part of remaining compliant with your immigration status in the US, and not filing or misfiling can affect future immigration statuses, like getting longer term visas in the US in the future. Also, if you don't file and you owe money, fines, penalties, and interest can add up there, so you certainly don't want that. Also, be very, very careful about options being recommended to you. Again, you might be working with US citizens or living with US citizens or residents. They might have different tax rules that apply to them than you as a non-resident for tax. So a big thing here is that there is a lot of softwares out there that help US citizens and residents, but they don't help non-residents for tax. TurboTax is one such example. They only support residents for tax purposes. They do not support non-residents for taxes. Sprintax Returns is dedicated software to just preparing non-resident tax returns for those of you on your J visas or also all other non-residents for tax purposes. So there is help on hand out there for non-residents for tax purposes. For those of you that are about to start your employment in the USA, it's very likely that your employer will ask you to complete what's called a W-4 form, which helps them to understand how much federal tax they should withhold on your income. The good news here is that Sprintax Returns software is there to actually help prepare the W-4 form for you. It can also understand your tax residency, if you are exempt from FICA tax withholding, and much more. So if you're starting your job in the USA in the next couple of weeks, or you're just about to do so, I really recommend going to Sprintax Forms on the sprintax.com website, creating an account, going through the questionnaire, and getting your tax forms generated so that you can get taxed correctly from day one with your employer. When it comes to your end of year tax filing obligations, Sprintax Returns is the software that you'll need to use there to help prepare your end of year tax returns. And your institution might provide you with a link to Sprintax. You'll go onto the Sprintax website on Sprintax Returns. You'll create an account if you've never used this before, or log in if you have. We'll then confirm your tax residency as your first step and make sure that you are a non-resident for tax. If you are, we'll then continue to bring you through the process, and we'll ask you about income you've earned during the year. If you have received US income, you can upload a copy of your W-2 form or any other income documents that you've received during the year. A side note here is that if you are an au pair, this page will look a little bit different. You can outline that you've received payments from your host family that haven't been reported on an income document, and will help you along the way there. There's also live chat on the system, so if you need help along the way, there is live chat on hand to help you with questions that you have on your tax filing obligations and on the software. We'll then also help to figure out your state tax filing obligations by asking questions around your time in the US and around the rules for the state that you have resided in during the year. For example, in this case, I've triggered a New York filing obligation and the system will let me know. And then you get to the order breakdown where you can, see what obligations you have, whether it's federal, state, a FICA tax claim, and you can then proceed to finalize and get your tax returns produced. So Sprintax will let you know as well if you're eligible to e-file your federal tax return, which you can then electronically submit that tax return to the IRS. If you're not eligible to e-file, you can print, sign, and mail your tax return by that April 15th deadline. If you just need to file a state return or Form 8843 alone, you will always need to print, sign, and mail these returns. And if you're not eligible to e-file your federal tax return, you will need to print, sign, and mail that return to the IRS. In terms of other support then on hand, there's a lot of educational tax videos for J1 program participants on our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of J1 tax guides on the Sprintax blog as well. That's going to make life a lot easier for your tax obligations. Our live chat is on the system 24/7. Our Sprintax form software is there to help you to prepare your employment tax forms to help you get set up correctly with your employer. And then we also run lots of workshops and webinars just like this one to make taxes that much simpler for Bridge USA program participants. So here's just an example of loads of J resources on hand. We've got different tax guides, even for employers that are tuning in or agents and sponsors. We've got a full tax communications kit that you could also share with your program participants and also your host employers, just to give an overview of non-resident taxes and the differences there between a non-resident and a resident for tax purposes. So I guess with that said, I hope that you found this session helpful. Again, I suppose the aim of this is to make you a little bit more comfortable with your tax obligations and to get prepared for the US tax system in the US. I know it's confusing. I know there's a lot in there, but hopefully this will make you a little bit more comfortable about US taxes in general as you go through the 24 tax year and as you enter the 2024 tax filing season between January and April of 2025. So thank you to all for listening. Hopefully I didn't put anyone to sleep there, and I wish you all the very best of luck on your program. And again, don't forget, US taxes is really, really important. So make sure to oblige by your US obligations, and best of luck with your 2024 tax returns when you get there in 2025. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.